"Good Lord, you poor thing," said the man. "Look, I only live just down the road. You wait here," and with that he thrust his portfolio, his tin of crayons, and his rolled-up sheet of paper into her hands, and he set off at a trot down to the gates, his shoulders hunched against the driving rain. A couple of minutes later, Scarlett saw the lights of a car and heard the sound of a car horn. Scarlett ran down to the gates where she could see the car, an elderly green Mini. The man she had been talking to was sitting in the driver's seat. He wound down his window. "Come on," he said. "Where exactly am I taking you?" Scarlett stood there, the rain running down her neck. "I don't take rides from strangers," she said. "Quite right, too," said the man. "But one good turn deserves all that. Here, put the stuff in the back before it gets soaked." He pulled open the passenger door, and Scarlett leaned inside and put his grave rubbings equipment down on the back seat as best she could. "Tell you what," he said, "why don't you phone your mother? You can use my phone. Tell her my car's number plate. You can do it from inside the car. You're getting soaked out there." Scarlett hesitated. Rain was beginning to plaster her hair down. It was cold. The man reached over and handed her his mobile phone. Scarlett looked at it. She realized she was more afraid of calling her mother than she was of getting into the stranger's car. Then she said, "I could call the police, too, couldn't I?" "You certainly can, yes, or you can walk home, or you can just call your mother and ask her to come and pick you up." Scarlett got into the passenger seat and closed the door. She kept hold of the man's phone. "Where do you live?" the man asked. "You really don't have to. You could just take me to the bus stop." "I'll take you home. Address 102A Acacia Avenue. It's off the main road, a wee bit past the big sports center." "You are out of your way, aren't you? Right, let's get you home." He took off the handbrake, swung the car around, and drove down the hill. "Been living here long?" he said. "Not really. We moved here just after Christmas. We lived here when I was 5, though." "Is that a brogue I detect in your accent?" "We've been living in Scotland for 10 years. There I sounded like everyone else, and then I came down here, and now I stick out like a sore thumb." She had wanted it to sound like a joke, but it was true, and she could hear it as she said it. Not funny, just bitter. The man drove to Acacia Avenue, parked in front of the house, then insisted on coming up to the front door with her. When the door was opened, he said, "Frightfully sorry. I took the liberty of bringing your daughter back to you. Obviously you taught her well. Shouldn't accept rides from strangers, but, well, it was raining, and she took the wrong bus, wound up on the other side of town. Bit of a mess all around, really. Say, you can't find it in your heart to forgive her and, me?" Scarlett expected her mother to shout at both of them, and was surprised and relieved when her mother only said, "Well, you couldn't be too careful these days, and was Mr. a teacher, and would he like a cup of tea?" Mr. said his name was Frost, but she should call him Jay, and Mrs. Perkins smiled and said he should call her Nuna, and she'd put the kettle on. Over tea, Scarlett told her mother the story of her wrong bus adventure, and how she had found herself at the graveyard, and how she had met Mr. Frost by the little church. Mrs. Perkins dropped her teacup. They were sitting around the table in the kitchen, so the cup didn't fall very far, and it didn't break, just spilled tea. Mrs. Perkins apologized awkwardly, and went and got a cloth from the sink to mop it up. Then she said, "The graveyard on the hill? In the old town? That one?" "I live over that way," said Mr. Frost. "Been doing a lot of grave rubbings, and it's technically a nature reserve." Mrs. Perkins said, "I know," thin-lipped. Then she said, "Thank you so much for giving Scarlett a ride home, Mr. Frost." Each word might have been an ice cube. Then, "I think you should leave now." "I say, that's a bit much," said Frost amiably. "Didn't mean to hurt your feelings." "Hey, Kimia. Was it something I said? The rubbings, they're for a local history project. It's not as if I'm, digging up bones or anything." For a heartbeat, Scarlett thought that her mother was going to strike Mr. Frost, who just looked worried. But Mrs. Perkins shook her head and said, "Sorry, family history, not your fault." As if she were making a conscious effort, she said brightly, Scarlett actually used to play in that graveyard when she was little. This is, 10 years ago, she had an imaginary friend, too, a little boy called Nobody. A smile twitched at the corner of Mr. Frost's lips. A ghosty? No, I don't think so. He just lived there. She even pointed out the tomb he lived in, so I suppose he was a ghost. Do you remember, love? Scarlet shook her head. I must have been a funny kid, she said. I'm sure that you were nothing of the, said Mr. Frost. You are raising a fine girl here, Nuna. Well, lovely cup of tea, always a joy to make new friends. I'll be toddling off now. Got to make myself a little dinner. Then I've got a meeting of the local History Society. You're making your own dinner? Said Mrs. Perkins. Yes, making it. Well, defrosting it, really. I'm a master of the boil in the bag, eating for one, living on my own. Bit of a crusty old bachelor. Actually, in the papers, that always means gay, doesn't it? Not gay, just never met the right woman. And for a moment, he looked rather sad. Mrs. Perkins, who hated to cook, announced that she always cooked too much food at the weekend, and as she ushered Mr. Frost out into the hall, Scarlet heard him agree that he would love to come round for dinner on Saturday night. When Mrs. Perkins came back from the front hall, all she said to Scarlet was, I hope you've done your homework. Scarlet was thinking about the afternoon's events as she lay in bed that night, listening to the sound of the cars grinding their way along the main road. She had been there, in that graveyard, when she was little. That was why everything had seemed so familiar. In her mind, she imagined and she remembered, and somewhere in there she fell asleep. But in sleep, she still walked the paths of the graveyard. It was night, but she could see everything as clearly as if it were day. She was on the side of a hill. There was a boy of about her own age, standing with his back to her, looking at the lights of the city. Scarlet said, Boy, what are you doing? He looked around, seemed to have trouble focusing. Who said that? And then, Oh, I can see you. Sort of. Are you dream-walking? I think I'm dreaming, she agreed. Not quite what I meant, said the boy. Hello, I'm Bod. I'm Scarlet, she said. He looked at her again, as if he were seeing her for the first time. Of course you are. I knew you looked familiar. You were in the graveyard today with that man, the one with the paper. Mr. Frost, she said. Yes, he's really nice. He gave me a lift home. Then she said, Did you see us? Yeah, I keep an eye on most things that happen in the graveyard. What kind of a name is Bod? She asked. It's short for nobody. Of course, said Scarlet. That's what this dream is about. You're my imaginary friend from when I was little, all grown up. He nodded. He was taller than she was. He wore gray, although she could not have described his clothes. His hair was too long, and she thought it had been some time since he'd received a haircut. He said, You were really brave. We went deep into the hill, and we saw the Indigo Man, and we met the Sleer. Something happened then in her head, a rushing and a tumbling, a whirl of darkness and a crash of images. I remember, said Scarlet, but she said it to the empty darkness of her bedroom and heard nothing in reply but the low trundle of a distant lorry making its way through the night. Interesting. There's so much. Neil Gaiman, the author, he's so good at world building, inventing a world in which these kind of magical things can happen to normal people. And it sounds to me like the way I read that that maybe like the Sleer was responsible for Scarlet forgetting. Like maybe somehow, I think Bod described that when he went down to see the Sleer, it felt like his head was full of cobwebs. Like he was sleepy. And maybe somehow the Sleer is able to block out the memory so people forget where the Sleer is and don't go back there. But Bod reminding her somehow like broke through the memory block, and suddenly she was able to remember all kinds of different things. Oh, We're getting close to the end. We are probably 3/4 of the way through, so we should start looking for those things that we think are going to be building toward a climax that are going to help us resolve or answer the questions that we've had since the beginning of the book. Why are people out there trying to find Bod? What do they want with his family? What has Silas been doing all these times when he's been disappearing? All those kinds of things are the Sleer. Like, what's going to happen with the Sleer? Is that done, or is that going to come back to be revisited? Anyway, until next time.